Did Craig Jones just change jiu-jitsu? He might have. He might have just changed the sport of jiu-jitsu. Now, I don't know. It's too early to tell. But that conversation is relevant. That idea, that talking point at a bare minimum is on the table of things that at least have to be discussed because of what an enormous success it was. You have people, both in terms of experienced grapplers and just new fans of the sport, saying it's the best grappling event they've ever seen, or for newer fans, it's the only one they've ever watched from a grappling event from beginning to end. It was the only one that kept their attention. I know there was a wrestling creator, a scholastic wrestling creator, who said it was the first time he ever watched a jiu-jitsu event from beginning to end and really loved it. This was a revelatory event. The CJI, the Craig Jones Invitational 1, which took place at the Thomas & Mack Center last Saturday, the same day, or at least overlapping days of ADCC with the exception of Sunday, was so much more successful than certainly I thought possible, and we had Craig Jones on the show. There's a lot to get to. I want to talk about the good, I want to talk about the bad, but we have to talk about a broad overview of just how enormous the success of this event has actually been. Heading into CJI, I really thought that the big storyline or the big idea about this was that, hey, we're going to put $1 million up for the two brackets, the plus 80 kilo, the minus 80 kilo division. And hey, in a sport where people don't get paid very much, and of course this was a bit of a protest against ADCC, who did raise some of their pay across divisions and then overall in some cases, but nevertheless spent a lot of their money on the T-Mobile Arena, a lot of their money on the production elements. And by the way, ADCC did look nice. I want to be clear about that. But again, I thought that CJI was a protest about money, that the event wouldn't be nearly as good, or it might even be pretty good, but not really in any potential way game-changing, other than, hey, look what we can do when we try to do a different event and pay the athletes more. And I want to be clear, paying the athletes more did play a big role here, in part because it recruited just the right kind of talent that they needed to get some of the big matches. Cade Ruotolo versus Andrew Tackett is a big example of that, right? I mean, you had guys like Ruotolo who were scheduled to be in ADCC who withdrew, and then, of course, that plays a big role in overall what CJI became. But that's really not the big story. That is part of the story, but it's much, much bigger than that. The big story about all of this is CJI did not feel like a cheap clone of ADCC or even a somewhat different alternative to it. CJI felt like the future of jiu-jitsu. CJI, to me, felt like the next evolution in submission grappling pro events. It felt to me like, I don't know if this was big enough to necessarily get picked up on network television, but if anything is, it's CJI. It was a reimagined way to do jiu-jitsu. Paying the athletes in the way that they were was a big component to getting them through the door. But once you got them through the door, there's so much more to it. I had been very skeptical that the alley, this sort of this slanted wall that they had basically just borrowed from Karate Combat, was ever going to be anything, and that could not have been more wrong. The wall, the alley, was instrumental in keeping the action going. You could see the athletes use it in all different kinds of ways. They would run up it, they would lean against it, they would press against it, but whatever the case, the referee had very little role in having to stop and restart and then award points and all that kind of nonsense. The referee had a role to play, but it was very much minimized. The alley just kept everything going. Also, I am still not convinced that open scoring is necessarily a great idea for MMA, but it worked really well in this particular circumstance. Now, we'll get to some of the bad about that later, but the point I wanted to make was this was action that was digestible for both newcomers as well as experienced pros and everybody in between, and it was incredibly dynamic all the way through. There was no learning curve to understanding it. There was no learning curve to really enjoying it. Now, of course, yes, some of the finer technical details about this K-guard and that Choi bar and everything else, most folks can't follow that kind of stuff, me included for a huge portion of it. But that's not what I mean by not understanding it. But getting the general flow, understanding where things are headed, kind of getting a sense of who's up, who's down. CJI massively over-delivered relative to expectations. And again, I want to reiterate one more time, ADCC did not look bad. It actually looked pretty good. But it also looked like they were trying to maintain a standard of excellence that was pegged to a point in time that isn't as relevant anymore. I don't mind that when they have the 3 mats at once, because it actually keeps the action going pretty quickly. And in fact, if CJI had an issue, we'll talk about this in just a second, the length of the day one broadcast was really not great. But more to the point, what ADCC felt like they were trying to do was show who was the real gorilla in the room. They were trying to show that they were the real kings. And on some level, I want to be clear, like there was great action there, great winners. One of my favorite moments from the entire weekend of Michael Pixley defeating Nicholas Marigali with the throw and off the overhook. This was from ADCC. They did not have a bad event. No one could argue they had a bad event. But what they didn't have was something that made me feel like jiu-jitsu could be raised to the next level. They did not have something that made me feel like, wow, this is really what jiu-jitsu of the future potentially looks like. They did not have something that, again, other than people who had a Flow grappling subscription, who are hardcores, had people engaged in a way with the sport that they never had been before. That is what CJI had. CJI offered a handshake to people who had never really been offered one in a serious way into the sport of jiu-jitsu. And again, not just new people, but old people who had been watching for some time, re-engaging with the sport under terms they hadn't really ever seen before. It was an overwhelming success in every way possible. And I want to be clear, the thing that puts it all together is Craig Jones himself. Craig Jones promoted the balls off of this event. He was on our podcast, on Morning Combat, and everybody else. He was on Ariel Helwani's, on Lex Friedman's, on Joe Rogan's. He was on Fitness Podcast. He was on with my guy, More Plates, More Dates. He did everything he possibly could to promote this event, and everyone thought it was just about one man making a gripe about pay, when in reality what it was is Craig Jones has been seeing things in the sport of jiu-jitsu totally different for a long, long time. You see it in the way in which he makes jokes about the sport and its sort of over-reliance on this phony masculinity and how much he pokes fun at that. But also, not just on the lighter side of things, also on, is there a way to look at the sport and understand it and then present it to audiences in a way that is much more palatable than what we have been doing up to this point? Everyone thought that was a secondary consideration, that the pay was going to come first. Everything was about pay. But in reality, Craig Jones has been, from a technique standpoint, seeing jiu-jitsu differently. From a way in which everyone views the sport from inside itself, he saw it differently. And in terms of pay, he saw things differently. The through line, the thing that connects all of these different, seemingly disparate ideas together, is one man who has a completely unique vision, or at least a very, very unusual vision, bringing that to life, using perhaps pay as something of a Trojan horse, but then showing so much more about it. Craig Jones brings new life into jiu-jitsu because he is seeing it differently than everybody else. ADCC was trying to make, in my judgment, a bit of an older model look as good as it could, and it looked good. That is not the same as, could we do this differently? Could we do this better? Could we do this bigger? Could we do this in a way that no one's really done it before? That is what CJI did. There's just any number of different things you could pick here. First of all, just look at some of these social numbers that they came up with. Absolutely dramatic. They added, I think, nearly 40 or 50,000 subs to the B Team YouTube channel, putting it on YouTube and getting well over 120,000 concurrent live viewers for the program was genius. Absolutely genius, because it exposed people to jiu-jitsu for free, basically, for free, in a way that they'd never been able to access it before. They didn't have to get a Flow Grappling subscription. They didn't have to get a Fight Pass subscription. They didn't have to go to ESPN Plus. They just had to go to regular old YouTube, and it worked perfectly to make sure that everybody could see the kind of spectacle that Craig Jones had promised with the Gabby Garcia stuff and everything else. It was as simple could be. Just go on YouTube. You don't have to register. You don't have to like. You don't even have to subscribe. Just watch. Just watch. And you can send it to as many people as you want to. You can promote it as far and wide as you want to. The exposure that they got from this is absolutely second to none. To the point I can't overstate it. You had people, Open Note Grappling, saying on Twitter that people came to his school because they had seen CJI for the first time, or they had seen jiu-jitsu for the first time vis-a-vis CJI, and now they wanted to train. That's anecdotal evidence, certainly, but it's a kind of an indication about what the larger sentiment appears to be about that. So in terms of what they did on social, in terms of what they did on YouTube, massive engagement, massive audiences, because they did not put up any impediments to get there. Now, there is a downside to that, a pretty big one, actually. But on the positive side, in terms of raising awareness, in terms of showing what their vision looked like, putting as few obstacles as possible in the way so that folks could see it, was a stroke of genius. And I can't overstate this. I was super skeptical about the alley and whether it would work. It worked so much better than I ever thought possible. I actually don't even really know what value it serves for karate combat, but it serves a huge value for CJI. And again, it took one man's vision to kind of understand what was really possible there. So that is very interesting to me as well. But the action overall delivered all the way through. Now, the credit doesn't just go to the rule set. The credit doesn't just go to the alley. It also goes very much to the athletes themselves. And CJI, one of the big wins you could say that they had, and one of the good things about it was they had so many good matches. Although, we'll talk about some of the downsides too, but the Andrew Tackett and Cade Ruotolo match, I mean, there was many great matches, but that might be the best match of the weekend. There are some folks saying it's the best match in submission grappling history, and I don't know if that's true, but it's in the conversation. It was a dramatic win for this tournament to have these two guys paired up in this way under these rule sets, all the things combined to just make absolute magic on the mat. I did not think much of the alley. I did not know really what to expect, and I knew you had some good competitors along the way, but everything worked so much better than I think even skeptics like me thought possible. I could go and list some other stuff too. It was a great event for charity. It raised a bunch of money. It raised a bunch of visibility for the athletes themselves who had done really well. Even those the ones who didn't win, there was some great performances certainly along the way. But the thing I would go back to, if I could really pinpoint like what CJI did well, was it showed a possibility of what jiu-jitsu looks like under true innovation, of what it looks like. Again, sport jiu-jitsu, not street jiu-jitsu, not so much in the gym jiu-jitsu, but at the highest level, or a pretty high level certainly, the sporting side of it, what it could be, how big it could be, what it could look like. Can this be palatable? I do think there will be always limits to jiu-jitsu and exactly how big it could be, but people having new ideas about that and what effect it can have. Just go look around the internet. Don't take my word for it. Look at some of the sentiment that people are expressing about CJI and what it meant to them and how different it was and how it recaptured and rekindled their interest. People had been kind of dismissive of it, what is even possible, and this is just something for a very small subsection of the sport. Not anymore. Not anymore. There's much more to it now. There's a bigger audience for it because it was not re-delivered with different pay. It was newly delivered with all different kinds of reasons, pay being perhaps chief among them, or at least certainly a main one, but far and away not the only one. This wasn't just a different event. This was jiu-jitsu, sport jiu-jitsu, no-gi sport jiu-jitsu, reimagined. That's different. I have to be fair, or at least as fair as I possibly can be, to the reality that as much hype as there was for CJI, and there was a lot, and by the way, I hear it with some pretty decent authority that CJI beforehand had a lot of different difficulties trying to get different entities to work with them and got a lot of no's. And after the weekend, I'm betting that there's a lot of people now regretting saying no to Craig Jones and saying no to what they were putting together because they unleashed a beast with this. But there are some downsides too. So we should talk about them. The first thing I'm going to say is there was a big discrepancy between the minus 80 kilo tournament and the plus 80 kilo. Now, Nicky Rod looked incredible. He looked so awesome. And I know there was some injury withdrawals, and neither tournament ended up being, in terms of what it was supposed to be on paper, what it ultimately ended up being in the end. And that's not anyone's fault. Nicky Rod looked incredible. 4 wins, 4 submissions. He was not going to be stopped. He looked the best maybe he's ever looked and was a very deserving winner. But in general, those matches were slower. They were less dynamic. It took a lot more time to get going. The minus 80 kilo tournament was vastly better. Again, even the guys who didn't win, Levi Jones Leary, just ridiculous. Joseph Chen didn't win, but he looked awesome too. And many others. One tournament was just a lot better than the other. 10 hours for the first day broadcast, it's just way too long. You got to tighten that up. And I don't know what the answer is, because they only want to have 1 match at a time versus ADCC having 3 at a time. And so it's naturally going to be slower, but it just can't be 10 hours. Also, getting back to like what the tournament problems were, Fionn Davies was right in sort of noting maybe there should be a women's division next time, or a couple of women's divisions. She's right. If there's a future for this tournament, getting them involved seems like a no-brainer. They fixed this later, but one sort of small issue I had was during the weekend itself, I was checking out trending videos on YouTube, and I noticed something, that the Pixley win over Miragali had gone to trending on the US in YouTube, and there was no CJI trending, and I was like, how is that possible? It's because they didn't do any of the pull-out stuff. Like everything that they did from day 1 and day 2 just lived on those videos. They didn't take out the Tackett and Ruotola match until like several days after. And that seems like part of a concerted strategy. So I understand it wasn't happening because anyone was lazy or bad. It was part of an effort to, I think, maintain the integrity of those streams. Nevertheless, I think it was an error. I think there was probably a little bit more that could have happened on their end to really engage with how special it was. It could have been even bigger. This is a smaller gripe, but I just sort of want to point out for next time, if there is a next time, and I certainly hope that there is, some of these things could be done a little bit differently. There were some judging issues. Listen, I'll put the criteria for CJI on the screen, and I want to say in general, I think most of the matches got it right. It is still not clear exactly what the judging, or rather, it is not clear exactly if this judging criteria is applied consistently. It's just hard to tell right now. Granted, we only had 2 tournaments, the plus 80 and the minus 80 kilo. There's only been 1 CJI event. Nevertheless, I don't know that there's a really fully coherent strategy for judging that is fully implemented, which makes some sense. You're going to get inconsistencies for the very first event unless it's fully fleshed out. And part of this was a bit of a trial and error. And I think that they've got probably some good information. So we'll see how it goes the next time. But I will just say, if you felt like there was inconsistent judging along the criteria, you would not be alone. God bless Gabby Garcia. She seems like a good sport. She's a hell of a competitor. And I met Renato Laranja, I think at Glory Last Man Standing like 10 years ago. He's hilarious. And he was unbelievable in the promo video that they made. Like the face-off video between Gabby and Craig, like Renato Laranja was so funny. I don't know how great it was for the middle of the event when we're trying to get from a match to match and he's out there doing shtick in the crowd. Love the guy. Didn't do a lot for me, if I could just be honest. I don't think that the objective was to make a ton of money with this event, but for sure this event lost money. I mean, if you just think about the reality of how you're going to make money. You're going to make money from sponsors, you're going to make money from concessions, merch, Livegate, and then your broadcast deal, where there was no broadcast deal. And of all those things I mentioned, in general, your broadcast deal, there'll be some differences here and there, but in general, your broadcast deal will be the one that is by far the most lucrative. They didn't even have one. This event didn't. I would bet everything I own that this event did not make money. And again, I don't think that was the intended goal per se, but we should be clear about something. It did not make money, and therefore you do have to question how much longer this can be done at scale if the benefactors who made the first one happen don't want to do it again. It's not like it's a self-sustaining business at this point. I know folks are being like, oh, what about all the sponsors? Dude, if you look at that mat in the alley, it's a lot of like B-Team stuff. El Segundo Podcast, Productions, B-Team itself. I know they had the Marek Health sponsorship, and there were some other ones as well. But again, there were a lot of companies that I have it on pretty good authority said no to CJI. There is a significant amount of money left on the table as a consequence, to say nothing of the fact that they didn't have a broadcast deal. They did have some pretty decent attendance, which I thought was great. And my understanding is the attendance relative to ADCC by the second day was pretty negligible, although CJI just, again, had much more on-the-ground enthusiasm. But you get the idea. Like, the event did not make money. This was not something that just was raking in the bucks. It was designed for charity. It was designed to show a vision. It was designed for a purpose, not designed for being self-sustaining. However, you just can't escape those broader considerations going forward, considering this is what makes the world turn. I'm blown away. I'm completely, totally blown away by CJI. I had reasonably decent expectations, and I thought what Craig had been doing with pay was real noble and, sticking his neck out there in an industry that didn't necessarily want what he was offering. And many of the power players, that really is the lesson I take from this. The industry itself, right? The businesses, the people in charge of the keys to the kingdom, the broadcasters, they did not want CJI. They did not want any part of it. But I think the people did. The fans did. Many of the grapplers did themselves. And that is what powered this. The reason why you're seeing such a different level of enthusiasm is because ADCC had a good event. They had a great event. There was nothing really bad about it, but it was this established order that did not want to be challenged. And Craig Jones came along and got the people, and I hate to say it on these terms, but it's true. Craig Jones is the king of the street, right? I don't mean street fighting. I'm not saying he's Marco Huas. I'm saying he got the people to really back this. He got the real voice of the jiu-jitsu community in terms of the people themselves, and then all these other MMA fans and interested spectators involved, and that's what powered CJI. That's the difference. It was the establishment versus the upstart, and the upstart was able to create an enormous amount of enthusiasm by pointing out all of the errors about the establishment. It just so happens in doing that, he introduced this new way of showing the sport that may just revolutionize everything. Or maybe it doesn't. It's simply too early to tell. But who was the big winner between CJI and ADCC 2024 over the weekend? Folks, it was CJI with a bullet. Craig Jones has somehow found himself at the top of the sport, and I think everyone now is going to be walking to him hat in hand. I don't know when CJI 2 is going to happen or what it's going to look like, but Craig Jones might have started a revolution. I look forward to seeing how it unfolds.